The fortress stood silent in the frozen heart of France. Its gray stone walls rose like a fortress of ice, cold and unyielding, trapping the chill of winter within their stones. Snow drifted along the battlements, piling against the arrow slits like powdery white feathers. The wind howled outside, clawing at the walls, hissing through the narrow openings as if it had a message for those inside. Every sound, every creak of timber or clatter of metal echoed through the halls like a warning. This was a place built not for comfort, but for control, for power, for history to remember or forget its occupants. Inside, a young girl stood in a chamber small enough to echo her every breath. She was 12 years old, though her eyes carried a weight far older than her years. Her name was Isabelle of Valois, daughter of King Charles V of France. Her long, pale hair had been brushed until it shone like glass under the flickering torchlight, and her attendants moved around her with quiet, solemn precision. They whispered prayers she could barely understand, their words blending into a continuous hum, like the drone of a distant storm. A heavy linen shift pressed down on her shoulders, too heavy for her slight frame, and a thin veil lowered over her face carried the faint perfume of lavender and candle wax. When the attendants finished, she did not look like a child. She looked like something set apart, something fragile, yet expected to endure the weight of kingdoms. Every movement, every breath reminded her that she had no choice in what was coming. Outside the chamber, the wind tried to break in. Inside, the air itself felt thick with ritual, with dread, with the unspoken truth that her body had already become a document, proof that the treaty between France and England would be kept. Down in the great hall, King Richard II of England waited. He was 29 years old, already hollowed by grief. His first queen, Anne of Bohemia, had died young, and the sorrow of her loss had spread through the kingdom like ash. England had mourned with him. Its bells had tolled not only for her passing, but for the death of his youth, of hope, of the life he had imagined for himself. Yet kings cannot mourn forever. The world demanded peace, even if it came at the cost of innocence. And so, Isabelle had been sent across the channel. Her marriage was no union of hearts, it was a treaty, sealed in flesh and blood. She was a child, but her body was a promise of peace. Every step she had taken to this night had been planned by men far older, far colder. They had measured the political consequences, calculated the benefits, and weighed her life like a coin. And now, at 12 years old, she stood at the center of history, silent, trembling, aware of the enormity of what was expected of her. The attendants continued their preparations. They adjusted her shift, whispered another line of prayer, and brushed her hair one last time. Every motion was ritualistic, precise, necessary. They did not look at her with tenderness, nor did they meet her eyes. Their duty was to prepare her, not to comfort her. Isabelle, in the quiet of that room, pressed her small hands together, clutching a rosary her mother had given her. She could feel the cold stone beneath her feet, the weight of her future pressing down as heavily as the shift on her shoulders. Outside, the winter wind screamed against the fortress walls, but inside, silence dominated. The only sounds were the subtle clinking of metal from the attendants' tools and the soft murmur of prayers. Soon the air would fill with another sound, one that Isabelle could not escape, one that would mark her life forever. The wedding itself had been a celebration, a spectacle of color, music, and ceremony. Bells had tolled across the city, nobles had exchanged jewels, Priests had sung blessings, and feasts had stretched long into the night. From the outside, it looked like a triumph. Peace had finally come to the kingdoms. History would remember the grandeur, the unity, the joy. But Isabelle had known since her earliest childhood, that the real event, the true test, would follow. When the music faded and the goblets emptied, the atmosphere shifted. Celebration gave way to silence. The nobles and priests who had cheered and blessed from the balconies and halls now withdrew, leaving only the attendants, the guards, and the young girl. The grandeur of the wedding was gone, replaced by a quiet dread that wrapped around Isabelle like the heavy linen on her body. The first night of her marriage was not about love. It was about observation, verification, control. It was a ritual older than most of the living witnesses, designed to erase doubt and secure alliances. She did not speak when the attendants led her toward the chamber, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not cry. She could not. Each step echoed through the corridor, the stone walls cold and impassive as history itself. Guards took their positions outside. Priests murmured blessings. Physicians prepared their notes, their instruments of measurement and verification, treating her not as a child, but as evidence. She was no longer Isabelle of Valois. She was the bridge between nations, the living contract, the fragile proof that peace could endure. The door closed behind her. Outside, the wind roared as if mourning what would happen inside. The chronicles later recorded only fragments, the barest details. John Fraser, a French chronicler, noted simply, "By royal command, the betting was prolonged for a week to secure the alliance." Westminster Abbey's archives were equally blunt. Physicians attended daily to confirm that the union had been fulfilled. 7 days, 7 nights. In those hours, Isabelle's body became the stage on which kingdoms built their peace. She was 12 years old, standing alone in a chamber that smelled of wax, of stone, and of fear. Outside, history celebrated, but inside, it paused, waiting for a child to bear the burden of diplomacy. Isabelle's life, her childhood, her innocence, had been traded for something larger than herself, and she understood, even in her youth, that survival would mean enduring, that silence would become her armor, and that the world would see only the result, never the suffering. Time moved differently within the fortress. The wind outside continued its ceaseless howl, but inside, minutes stretched into hours. The torches burned, their flames quivering as if afraid to witness what would come. Isabelle stood, still as marble, her heart hammering with every echo of footsteps beyond the chamber door. History was here, in this moment, and it was merciless. And so, the stage was set. Isabelle of Valois, 12 years old, daughter of kings, was ready to become a part of history in a way that no child should ever be asked. The doors closed, the torches flickered, and the cold stone walls waited, silent witnesses to what was to come. Outside, the winter wind roared. Inside, Isabelle breathed in, steadying herself. Tomorrow, the first day of her real life, the one dictated by kingdoms, crowns, and men who saw her only as a symbol, would begin.
The bells rang across the city, loud and clear, cutting through the cold November air. Their sound carried through the streets and over the frozen fields, calling everyone to witness history. The fortress, gray and unyielding, seemed almost alive as the sounds of celebration brushed against its walls. Nobles from France and England had gathered, their banners fluttering in the wind, their armor shining like scattered sunlight. The feast tables were heavy with roasted meats, sweetbreads, and wines that warmed the stomach as much as the heart. But Isabelle did not hear the laughter or the music. She barely felt the warmth of the torches in the halls. She could only feel the weight of the heavy linen shift on her shoulders, the softness of her veil against her pale face, and the endless quiet that clung to her small chest like a second skin. The world outside was alive and bright, but inside her a storm raged. A storm she could not name, a fear she could not voice. Her attendants guided her through the hall, their hands steady and sure, as if they had done this 100 times before. Isabelle's small feet barely made a sound on the polished stone floors. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the bells, louder than the chorus of voices celebrating the peace her marriage was meant to bring. Her fingers, still clutching the rosary, trembled slightly. The wedding itself had been magnificent. Priests sang in voices that seemed to rise and fall like waves, blessing the union that was meant to end decades of bloodshed. Nobles exchanged glittering jewels and whispered congratulations, their faces bright with the illusion of hope. Everywhere Isabelle looked, there were smiles, speeches, and signs of triumph. But she could see through it all. She could see the truth beneath the golden banners and the ringing bells. This was not a celebration for her. It was a celebration for peace, and she, a child, was its vessel. King Richard II stood at the front of the hall, tall and composed. But there was a shadow in his eyes that no feast or music could erase. He had known grief, and he had learned that crowns demanded duty above desire. The death of his first queen, Anne of Bohemia, had hollowed him, leaving him cautious, almost cold. Yet duty still bound him, as it bound Isabelle. He was waiting for the moment when the ceremony would be complete, when the treaty between England and France would be sealed not in ink, but in flesh. The priests' chants rose higher, echoing off the stone walls, and Isabelle lowered her head in obedience. She did not understand all the words, but she knew the weight they carried. Each syllable was not a blessing for her heart or her happiness. It was a blessing for history, for kingdoms, for the men who had arranged her life long before she could even grasp what a life might be. As the final blessings were sung, the hall erupted in applause. Nobles raised their goblets high, offering toasts to the new union. Their voices rang with joy and relief, and outside the city erupted in celebration. Yet Isabelle felt only a deep, hollow silence. The music, the laughter, the cheering, none of it reached her ears. She was a witness to her own life, watching as the world moved on without her. And then the atmosphere changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the celebration faded. The nobles withdrew from the chamber. The priests left their chants unfinished, and the warmth of the hall seemed to seep away. The doors closed behind them, leaving only a few attendants, the guards, and Isabelle herself. Silence fell like a heavy curtain, smothering everything else. It was time for the real ritual to begin. Her attendants guided her toward a narrow corridor, torchlight flickering against the stone walls. Each step echoed like a warning. Isabelle's heart raced. Her small hands clutched the rosary tighter, but she could feel it slipping, as though even faith might not be enough to hold her together. Outside, the wind howled against the fortress, but inside, only silence remained. A silence that seemed louder than the bells had ever been. When they reached the chamber, Isabelle paused. She did not speak. She did not cry. She only nodded as her attendant stepped back, leaving her alone with the weight of history pressing down. The door closed with a sharp thud, and she was swallowed by shadows and cold. For Isabelle, the world had narrowed to this single space, this moment. Her body, her youth, her very existence had become a symbol of peace. The chronicles would record only fragments of what followed. 7 days, they would say, 7 nights. Each detail noted, measured, and signed by physicians, priests, and officials. Every breath she took would be an act of verification, a proof that the alliance between England and France was secure. She could feel their eyes, though she could not see them. Attendants whispered instructions, the physicians prepared their instruments, and the priests murmured prayers just outside the door. To them, this was duty. To her, it was survival. Isabelle closed her eyes and imagined herself far away on the banks of a quiet river, under the shade of trees, laughing freely with friends who no longer existed. But those visions vanished quickly. There was no escape, not here, not in this fortress, not in a world that had already decided what her life must be. The first night stretched long. Torches burned without pause. Attendants moved with silent precision. Every detail of her body, her reaction, her very breath would be observed, recorded, and bound into history. The men who wrote the chronicles treated her like a specimen, measuring, noting, and confirming. When she shivered from cold or fear, they called it reaction. When she cried, they called it temperament. When she trembled, they called it balance. Her humanity had been erased, replaced by duty. The lessons of that night would last forever. History would celebrate the treaty, the peace, the triumph. Nobles and priests would speak of it with pride, and Isabelle would be left with the memory of every hour, every moment, every fear endured in silence. Outside, the city continued its celebration. Bells rang, music played, and the world cheered. Inside, a 12-year-old girl waited, knowing that her life had been rewritten, her childhood traded for diplomacy. The fortress walls held her in, cold and indifferent, as though they understood the enormity of what was being demanded of her. And so the first chapter of Isabelle's real life, her life as a symbol, as evidence, as a bridge between nations, had begun. She did not know if she would survive it intact. She did not know if her body or spirit would endure the scrutiny and ritual that history demanded. All she knew was that she had no choice, and history was already watching.
The chamber was cold, the stone floor biting at Isabelle's small feet. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long, moving shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with the rhythm of the wind outside. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, cutting off the world of music, bells, and laughter. Outside, the wedding had been celebrated with grandeur. Inside, there was only silence, deep, heavy, unbroken. Isabelle of Valois, just 12 years old, stood alone in the pale light. Her attendants had withdrawn, leaving her with a handful of guards, clergymen, and physicians who would watch her every move. Their eyes were calm, clinical, and unyielding. They did not see a girl. They saw a body that must confirm a treaty, a fragile vessel that would become evidence. She could feel the weight of her linen shift, the scent of lavender and wax clinging to her skin, and the cold pressing against her shoulders like a crown she had never chosen to wear. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She tried to steady her breathing, but the fear inside her would not settle. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the shift of armor, and the quiet murmur of Latin from the priests reminded her that she was no longer just Isabelle. She was a symbol, a living proof that France and England could be at peace. The attendants had left her alone in the chamber, but she was never truly alone. Guards stood at the door, silent and watchful. Priests moved in and out on a schedule, murmuring blessings that she could not understand, their words more about order than comfort. Physicians took notes, observing her reactions, her pulse, her color, and even her fear, recording every detail with precise detachment. To them, this was a duty. To her, it was a siege. The first night stretched on endlessly. She could not sleep. She could only stand or sit, aware of every glance and every movement of those who had been assigned to ensure that the ritual went as it had always gone for brides of her rank. The wind outside howled against the fortress, but the sound could not reach the stillness of her own terror. She was trapped in stone walls that seemed to breathe with her anxiety, and every passing hour reminded her that her life was no longer her own. Time became meaningless. Day and night blurred into one unbroken period of observation. Servants delivered food and water on a precise schedule. Physicians examined her body, measuring her pulse, recording her reactions. They did not speak to her as a human being. They spoke of temperament, of humor, of balance, as though she were an experiment, a specimen. When she trembled from fear, they wrote it down. When her hands shook, they noted it. When tears slid silently down her cheeks, they considered it proof that she was alive, that the ritual was proceeding according to plan. Her mind wandered, trying to find something to hold on to. She imagined herself back in France, in the palace of her father, where silk curtains swayed with the breeze and the warm sun painted the walls gold. She imagined her mother's gentle voice comforting her, but even those visions could not last. She was here, and this chamber, with its cold stones and flickering lights, would not allow dreams. Isabelle's small frame ached from standing, from the weight of expectation pressing on her body. Every moment,
Every breath was part of a procedure that had been repeated countless times before her. The ritual was meant to erase doubt, to prove that the marriage was complete, to show that the alliance between France and England was secured. In the minds of the men who planned it, there was no cruelty in this. There was only logic, order, and duty. Yet Isabelle felt the cruelty in every bone, every heartbeat. She understood that she had no choice. The treaty demanded her compliance. Her body was no longer hers. It had become evidence, a living record that peace had been achieved. Outside, the world would celebrate. Inside, she endured. Every examination, every observation, every note written in Latin in the physician's careful hands reminded her that she was nothing more than a tool for men who spoke of kingdoms and alliances while ignoring the child they had sacrificed. The first night passed slowly. Hours stretched into an unbroken chain of observation. Priests moved in to chant blessings at scheduled intervals, guarding the sanctity of the act. Guards shifted silently in their armor, their presence a constant reminder that escape was impossible. Physicians came and went, measuring, noting, recording. Her body became the focus of bureaucracy, and her own fear and pain were invisible, unnoticed, irrelevant. When she dared to close her eyes, sleep would not come. The room was too silent, the shadows too alive. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of robes, the faint clinking of metal, kept her alert. She could feel the chamber pressing against her, stone walls narrowing around her as if they too understood the weight of what she was enduring. By the end of the night, Isabelle's limbs ached, her skin cold and her spirit trembling. She had survived, but the ordeal had only just begun. Outside the fortress, bells would toll for peace. Nobles would celebrate the success of the treaty. Priests would bless the union. But inside, in the flickering torchlight of a narrow chamber, a 12-year-old girl endured in silence, her body already written into history as evidence that kingdoms could be united. And as the first night ended, she understood something that would follow her for the rest of her life. This ritual would not be private. It would not be gentle. It would last not one night, but 7. Every hour, every breath, every tremor of fear would be noted, measured, and recorded. There would be no escape, no comfort, no childhood left. The first night had passed. The dawn would come, but for Isabelle it brought no relief. The fortress walls remained cold. The torches flickered, and the silence pressed in heavier than before. History had begun to take her, piece by piece, and she could do nothing but endure.
The second day began without warning. Isabelle awoke in the cold chamber, the torches still burning, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Her small body ached from the hours spent standing and sitting in preparation the night before. She shivered, despite the layers of linen and the faint warmth of the flickering fire. Outside, the wind howled against the fortress, but inside, the chamber was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a god's boots or the quiet whisper of a priest reciting Latin prayers. Isabelle's eyes opened slowly. She tried to take in her surroundings, the chamber feeling smaller with each passing hour, each day of this relentless ritual. She could feel the presence of the attendants who had not left entirely, hovering nearby with the quiet precision of their duties. The physicians arrived shortly after dawn, their faces calm, detached, their hands carrying instruments and scrolls for recording every detail. "You must remain still," one whispered, though it was not a request, it was a command. Isabelle nodded silently, too aware of the scrutiny around her to speak freely. Every movement, every breath, every shiver was being watched, measured, and written down. They recorded her pulse, her color, her reactions. When she trembled, they called it temperament. When she cried silently, they called it proof of life. There was no comfort in these words, only observation, only the cold calculation of duty. The hours passed slowly. Twice a day, food was brought to her. Small portions of bread, water, and thin soups. She ate mechanically, aware that even this simple act was being watched. Physicians made notes on the effects of her diet, timing, and behavior, as though her ability to endure the ritual could be tested, measured, and verified. She had no choice, no voice, no power in this process. She existed only as evidence. Outside the chamber, the world celebrated the marriage. Bells tolled, trumpets sounded, nobles smiled and toasted to peace. Yet Isabelle could hear none of it. The walls held her in silence, her body and spirit bound by ritual and observation. Every day followed the same pattern. Priests came at intervals to chant blessings, guards watched in shifts, and physicians entered methodically, recording, verifying, confirming. It was a relentless cycle of scrutiny and endurance. By the third day, Isabelle's small frame began to show the strain. Her skin grew pale, her hands trembled more noticeably, and her spirit quivered under the weight of expectation. Yet the physicians noted only her physical signs, their tone clinical, detached, precise. The chroniclers would later write that she was sound, despite the visible evidence of fear, fatigue, and pain. To the men who documented these events, survival was enough. They saw proof in her continued existence, not in her suffering. Isabelle closed her eyes often during the inspections, trying to imagine another world. She pictured the palace of her father in France, the warmth of her mother's hands, the softness of sunlight on her face. But each image faded quickly, replaced by the cold stone, the flickering torches, the constant scrutiny of those around her. She was no longer a child with dreams. She was a living document, a piece of evidence that could not falter. The fourth day brought little change. The ritual continued, the pattern unbroken. Guards shifted silently, priests murmured their prayers, attendants hovered, and physicians examined and recorded. Isabelle moved only when instructed, spoke only when required, and obeyed every command with mechanical precision. Her body, once her own, was now a tool of diplomacy, a bridge between nations, and a witness to the demands of power. By the fifth day, fatigue had become a constant companion. Isabelle's limbs ached, her back ached from the stiffness of standing or sitting for hours, and the weight of expectation pressed down more heavily than ever. Yet she endured. She had no other choice. Every examination, every observation, every note taken in Latin in the physician's careful hands reinforced the truth. She was alive, and the ritual continued. Her mind wandered sometimes, seeking refuge in memories or imagined futures. She thought of the warmth of her mother's embrace, the gentle voice that had guided her in childhood, the laughter of friends long gone. But the chamber would not allow such thoughts to linger. Every sound, every movement, every whisper reminded her that this was no longer a world for children. This was a world of duty, observation, and survival.
The sixth day approached with the same unyielding rhythm. Isabelle had become quiet, almost ghost-like in her movements. Her eyes, wide and fearful at first, now held a hollow steadiness, the calm of one who has endured too much to tremble visibly. Yet inside, the storm of fear, confusion, and sorrow raged unchecked. Every day brought new inspections, new observations, and new recordings. Every day reinforced the unyielding truth that she was no longer a girl, but evidence, a living proof that kingdoms could be united. And then came the seventh day, the final day of observation. Isabelle moved mechanically, her small body tired, her mind quiet but alert. The priests whispered their last blessings, the physicians made their final examinations, and the attendants ensured that every detail was observed. Outside, the bells rang once more, celebrating the conclusion of the marriage and the success of the peace treaty. Inside, Isabelle endured, as she had endured for 7 long days, silent and unbroken. When it was finally over, she emerged from the chamber, pale as parchment, trembling but alive. Her attendants supported her, guiding her through the corridors, while guards watched silently, ensuring that she remained under control. Chroniclers would later write that the marriage had been properly concluded according to custom, noting every measure observed by physicians and priests. No mention would be made of the fear, the pain, or the suffering of the girl who had endured it all. The world outside only saw the result, a successful union, a treaty sealed, a peace secured. But Isabelle felt the truth of what had happened. 7 days and nights of observation, scrutiny, and endurance had left marks invisible to the world. Her childhood had been taken, her body used as evidence, her spirit tested beyond anything a child should face. She was alive, yes, but at what cost? The fortress remained silent, cold, and unyielding. Outside, history celebrated. Inside, Isabelle's life had been rewritten. She had survived, but the ritual had already claimed something deeper than her body. It had claimed her innocence, her childhood, and a part of her spirit that would never fully return. The extended bedding, the 7-day verification had ended. The world saw a successful treaty and a marriage fulfilled. Isabelle saw only the shadows of what she had endured, the weight of duty pressed upon her, and the silence that would follow her for the rest of her life.
The 7th day had ended, and with it the long, unbroken chain of observation, examination, and ritual. Isabelle of Valois, pale and trembling, stepped out of the chamber into the quiet corridors of the fortress. Her small hands were unsteady, her body stiff from the hours of forced endurance. The torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, as if the stone itself remembered the ordeal. Outside, the world celebrated. Bells rang across the halls and the city beyond. Nobles exchanged congratulations, priests pronounced blessings, and courtiers whispered of the successful marriage, the treaty sealed, and the fragile peace that had been achieved. But for Isabelle, the echoes of celebration were distant, hollow. The grandeur, the joy, the music, it had never been hers. She had existed only for the observation, the ritual, the verification. Her attendants supported her, their hands steady but impersonal, guiding her through the corridors that had become her world. Guards flanked her path, silent and watchful, ensuring that she remained under control. Every step she took was measured, noted, and contained, just as it had been for the 7 days that had passed. She was alive, yes, but barely herself. King Richard II watched her emerge, the man who had waited for this moment, who had presided over the marriage and endured the formalities of ceremony, now faced the reality of what had been done. At 29, he had already been hollowed by grief. The death of his first queen, Anne of Bohemia, had left scars invisible to the world, but deep in his heart. He had mourned publicly, as kings must, but now he stood before a living record of duty fulfilled, a child transformed into evidence of peace. Richard II's eyes held a strange mixture of relief, discomfort, and something quieter, more private. Some whispered that guilt consumed him. Others said it was disgust. Whatever the truth, he withdrew from Isabelle almost entirely. He granted her chambers, attendants, jewels, and gifts, but not affection. To the courtiers, she remained a queen. To him, she was a symbol, a fragile token of alliance, too young to be touched, too small to hold the love of a man. The silence between them was a language of its own. Isabelle could not speak of the ritual, and he did not ask. She had endured what the world required. He would not acknowledge it. The fortress walls, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to mirror their relationship, distant, measured, and forbidding. In the days that followed, Isabelle learned the limits of her life within the English court. She was given attendants, jewels, and every sign of status, but she was never summoned to Richard's bed again. The marriage, recorded and verified, existed only on paper and in the chronicles of the kingdom. Outside observers saw a union fulfilled. Inside, a girl endured in quiet solitude. Chroniclers wrote of the marriage with clinical detachment. They noted the rituals had been completed. The physicians had confirmed the union, and the treaty was secure. There was no mention of the child at the center of it all, the girls whose body had been measured and scrutinized. Her fear, her pain, her trembling hands were erased from history. Only her survival mattered. Despite the silence, Isabelle's small world continued to be observed. Servants attended to her daily needs with ritualistic precision. Guards remained stationed, and the court continued to function around her. She moved through her days quietly, the memory of the 7 nights of observation lingering in every shadow, every step, every breath. Her childhood, once vibrant and full of life, had been traded for peace. Her body, once hers, was now a vessel of diplomacy. Isabelle found herself caught between 2 worlds. In public, she was the queen who had brought peace, the child who had secured a fragile alliance. In private, she was a girl stripped of her childhood,
forced into silence and marked by an experience that no one would ever speak of openly. The fortress, with its cold stone walls and flickering torches, became both her prison and her refuge. Richard II's withdrawal left a space of emptiness between them. He treated her with politeness in public, offering courtesies and formal attention, but he never reached beyond the boundaries of protocol. In private, his absence was profound. She had been the price of a treaty, and once the price was paid, he had no further need for her beyond appearances. The young king's grief for Anne of Bohemia had never fully faded, and Isabel's presence could not fill the void of loss he carried silently. Weeks passed, and the chroniclers noted only the continuation of court life. Isabel learned to navigate the routines of palace life, attending ceremonies and learning the expectations of her role. She wore the jewels, moved with the grace required of a queen, and followed every command with obedience. Yet beneath her composed exterior, the memory of the 7 nights of observation remained vivid. Every shadow, every step, every breath reminded her of what she had endured. The English court, for all its splendor, became a landscape of isolation. Isabel had status but not agency, attention but not affection, presence but not freedom. She learned to live within the confines of expectation, to endure the silence and the scrutiny, and to carry herself with quiet dignity. The memory of the ritual remained, a constant, invisible weight pressing on her spirit. Richard II would soon be deposed in 1399 by Henry of Bolingbroke. Isabel, barely 13, would witness the fall of her husband, the imprisonment of the former king, and the shifting of power in a land that remained foreign and unwelcoming. Her jewels, her dowry, and even her presence would once again be treated as political tools. She had survived the ritual, but survival brought no freedom. It brought only the next stage of being moved, measured, and exchanged for the sake of history. In the quiet moments, Isabel would remember the chamber, the torches, the eyes that had watched her. She would remember the cold stone walls and the heavy linen shift, the prayers she could not understand, and the ritual that had erased her childhood. She would carry the silence with her for the rest of her life, a memory that no one could touch, a truth that no one would record. And yet, in that silence, Isabel survived. She endured. The world called her queen, the church called her marriage holy, and the chronicles recorded the treaty and the union. But Isabel knew another truth that one history could not, or would not, acknowledge. She had been a child, measured and verified, transformed into evidence of peace, and left to navigate the aftermath alone.
Years had passed since Isabel endured the 7 days of observation, yet the memory of that chamber, the flickering torches, and the eyes that had watched her remained vivid in her mind. The fortress in England had been cold, indifferent, and unyielding. Now, at 15, she was being returned to France, sent back to the country of her birth, a place that had been both home and distant memory. The journey across the Channel was quiet and solemn. Isabel stood on the deck of the ship,
the cold wind tugging at her pale hair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though they were still bound by ritual. She did not cry, though the thought of her homeland brought a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. The water stretched endlessly before her, a cold, gray mirror reflecting the sky. Nothing moved in the world as she did. Even the sailors, bustling with work and shouted orders, seemed distant, as if her silence created a bubble around her that no one could penetrate. When she finally stepped onto French soil, the crowd that had gathered to greet her did not see a queen or a symbol of peace. They saw a ghost of one. Pale, quiet, and still, she moved among them as though her feet were not entirely her own. Courtiers and nobles whispered among themselves, remarking on her silence, her slow steps, and her pale expression. Isabelle did not speak. She did not smile. She only walked with her head slightly lowered, as if the weight of the years she had spent in England, the 7 days of observation, and the burdens of diplomacy were pressing upon her shoulders once more. She was delivered to the care of her mother, Queen Isabelle, who kept her close and quiet. The palace walls were familiar, yet different. Her chambers were filled with the familiar scent of lavender and wax, the soft tapestries and silks of her childhood. Yet even here, Isabelle felt the shadow of what had been done to her, the memories that could not be erased, and the silence that now defined her life. Her mother offered comfort, but even the warmth of family could not undo the years of ritual and observation, the forced endurance that had hollowed her at 12. For years, Isabelle remained mostly out of public view. She avoided the court, the gatherings, and the celebrations. Some whispered that she refused to wear the jewels she had once possessed, claiming that they belonged to another life. Others said she slept each night with a candle burning beside her bed, afraid of darkness, locked doors, and the silence that reminded her of that first night in England. The child who had once been sent across the Channel to secure a treaty had returned a young woman, but her spirit carried the weight of a childhood that had been stolen. At 16, the machinery of monarchy moved again. Isabelle was to be wed once more, this time to Charles of Orléans, a young noble closer to her own age. The wedding was modest, a quiet ceremony compared to the grandeur of her first marriage. There were no physicians, no priests conducting observations, no attendants enforcing schedules. For the first time, Isabelle was allowed to move freely, to speak without fear of scrutiny, to live as a young woman rather than a symbol of peace. The ceremony took place in a small chapel, the walls adorned with banners, the air filled with the quiet murmurs of family and attendants. Charles of Orléans, young and kind, stood before her, his eyes gentle, his hands offering warmth and care. For the first time, Isabelle felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that she had been denied for so long. There was no need for verification, no ritual demanding her compliance, no witnesses recording her every motion. She could simply be human. In this second marriage, Isabelle found the life she had been denied. She bore children, rediscovering laughter and learning to write letters, to read verse, to embrace the small joys of daily life. The young queen, once a child forced into evidence, now experienced love, care, and the beginnings of happiness. Her body was no longer a document. Her spirit was no longer under inspection. For the first time in years, she felt whole. Yet, the memories of her first marriage, the 7 days of observation, and the isolation in England never fully left her. They lingered in quiet moments, in the shadows of her chambers, and in the pauses between her laughter. Isabel had endured what no child should endure, and though her life had resumed, the echoes of her suffering remained. They were invisible, silent, and indelible, a reminder of the price she had paid for peace. Even as she built a new life, the lessons of endurance, silence, and obedience shaped her. She moved carefully through the world, aware of the fragility of her safety and the need for vigilance. Her experiences had taught her resilience, but also the weight of what power demanded of those it used. The girl who had once been examined, measured, and verified now guided her own life with caution and awareness, understanding the value of every choice she could finally make for herself. Charles of Orleans proved a gentle companion. Together they navigated the court, raised children, and found moments of peace. Yet Isabel carried the silence of her past, the quiet remembrance of nights in a chamber where her childhood had ended, where her body had been used to secure alliances, and where history had claimed her as a witness to diplomacy. She never spoke of it openly, but the memory shaped her every action, every decision, every word she chose to share. History for the world recorded a queen who married, bore children, and maintained the lineage of her house. The chronicles celebrated her second marriage as peaceful and proper, without ever acknowledging the shadow of her first. Yet for Isabel, the truth was always present. She had survived, endured, and reclaimed a small measure of life, even if the memory of what had been taken could never be fully erased. And so the young Queen of France lived in a delicate balance between the world she had been forced to endure and the life she was now allowed to build. She had been a child sacrificed to diplomacy, a body measured for peace, a witness to the rituals of men who spoke of kingdoms while ignoring the humanity of a girl. Yet she had survived, she had returned, and in her quiet, unbroken way, she had reclaimed what had been stolen, piece by piece.
Time flowed differently for Isabelle in her later years. The fortress in England, the cold torches, and the 7 days of observation had long passed, yet their shadow remained, quiet but unyielding. She lived now in France with her husband, Charles of Orleans, and their children. Yet even in the warmth of family and home, the memory of what had been demanded of her at 12 lingered like a faint, unshakable echo. She moved through her days with a careful grace, the product of years in which every motion had been observed and recorded. She learned to speak softly, to listen more than she spoke, and to navigate the complexities of court life with quiet precision. Her body had been her first proof, her first evidence. Now her mind, her experience, and her endurance guided her every action. She had survived, yet survival had left marks no one could see. The chronicles of history recorded a queen who bore children, maintained her lineage, and carried out her duties with dignity. Artists painted her serene and saintly, surrounded by angels. Illuminated manuscripts captured her calm, gentle figure, always veiled in white, almost frozen in the memory of her first night as a bride. The public image of Isabel was one of grace and virtue, a queen who fulfilled her role without complaint.
Yet the reality behind the veil was far different. Her first marriage, to Richard II of England, remained a secret in its details. Only the cold notes of physicians and the sparse sentences of chroniclers survived to tell the story. They recorded the ritual, the 7 days of observation, and the verification of the marriage. They did not record her fear, her trembling, and the weight of her body and spirit under scrutiny. They did not speak of the child forced to serve as a living treaty. That history remained silent, as though the truth was too raw to survive in words. Her second marriage, however, allowed her a glimpse of normalcy. Charles of Orleans treated her with kindness, a gentle awareness of her past that he never questioned but always respected. Together they built a household, raised children, and created a small world where her past no longer controlled every moment. There were letters, poems, and quiet laughter that had once been impossible. She began to reclaim what had been lost, though the memory of the ritual remained as a silent companion, a shadow in the corners of her mind. Despite this life of care and comfort, Isabelle remained haunted by her first marriage. The memory of 7 days of observation, the cold torches, and the priests, guards, attendants, and physicians remained vivid. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every small sound could recall that time to her mind. She had endured what no child should endure. She had survived a ritual meant to erase doubt by erasing humanity itself. And though she now lived with love and relative freedom, the echoes of her suffering never fully disappeared. By the time she turned 20, Isabelle's health had begun to fail. Chroniclers noted that she fell ill, consumed by what they described as frailty and grief. The years of endurance, the physical and emotional toll of her first marriage, and the silent burden she carried may have left their mark on her body as much as on her spirit. The young queen, once a child forced into evidence, now faced mortality in quiet solitude. When Isabelle died at 20, history noted her passing with the calm detachment that had always accompanied her life. She was mourned as a queen, as a wife, and as a mother. But the memory of her suffering, the years when her body had been transformed into a tool of diplomacy, was left unspoken. Her life, like her story, became a mix of celebration and silence, visible in public acts and invisible in the private reality of her existence. Yet the marks of her endurance remained. The artists who painted her after death often captured her veiled and serene, a gentle figure surrounded by angels. They could not, and perhaps dared not, show the fear, the trembling, and the young child who had survived 7 days of ritual. In stained glass and manuscripts, Isabelle became a symbol of patience, grace, and quiet dignity. Her suffering, her endurance, and her survival were erased from the public eye, transformed into an image of divine serenity. Modern historians, however, would later uncover the records, the royal ledgers, the physicians' notes, the chronicles that describe the extended bedding, the 7-day verification, and the observation of a child turned into evidence. These documents reveal a world in which power, law, and faith were intertwined to justify acts that today would be recognized as cruelty. They show how Isabel's life was used as a tool to secure peace, to bind nations, and to prove legitimacy. In those records, we find the truth behind the image. A 12-year-old girl, prepared, observed, and recorded in a chamber for 7 days, her body measured and noted, her childhood erased in the name of duty. We see the young queen who returned to France, the girl forced into silence, and the woman who survived to reclaim some measure of life in a second marriage. There were the layers of history, bureaucracy, and politics that masked her suffering while celebrating her endurance. Isabel's story remains a haunting reminder of the cost of power, diplomacy, and control. She did not rule, she did not lead armies, and she did not sign decrees. Yet history moved forward over her, stepping lightly over the child who had been transformed into evidence of peace. Her story is one of survival, endurance, and silent witness to the cruelty that civilization can sometimes disguise as order. The castles she had walked, the corridors she had traversed, and the chambers she had endured remain today in fragments of stone. Westminster, Windsor, and the keeps along the Channel still hold the echoes of the past. If one listens carefully, it is said, one might hear the faintest whisper of her breath, the rustle of linen, the prayer whispered too late, and the small frightened presence of a child who had been forced to carry the weight of history alone. Her name, Isabelle of Valois, is seldom spoken, yet she remains in the shadows of history as one of its earliest victims of bureaucratic cruelty. The kind of cruelty that wears robes instead of armor, speaks in Latin instead of rage, and calls itself righteous. She did not choose her crown, her husband, or her destiny. She chose only to endure. And through that endurance she survived long enough to leave a mark, however quiet, upon the pages of history. Even in death, Isabel's image was used to convey serenity and patience. But behind the serene portraits, the veiled faces, and the manuscripts lies the truth of a child transformed into a tool of diplomacy, a witness to the demands of power, and a girl whose life became the ground upon which nations built their fragile peace. The past does not vanish. It lingers in chambers, in corridors, in records, and in the quiet spaces where history chooses to remember some and forget others. Isabel's life, her suffering, and her endurance remain, preserved not in song or legend, but in the faint, haunting traces left in the